The autumn of 2024 had been bittersweet for Ozzy Osbourne. Just weeks after his triumphant induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, where Billy Idol had performed a spine-tingling version of No More Tears in his honor, the Prince of Darkness knew his time was running shorter than ever. The Parkinson's disease that had ravaged his body was progressing relentlessly, and the spinal surgeries had left him weaker than he'd ever been. But that October night at the Rock Hall ceremony had been magical. Watching Billy Idol, the man he'd known for decades, the fellow British rocker who had carved his own rebellious path through the music industry, sing one of his most personal songs with such passion and respect had moved Ozzy more than he could express publicly. It was Billy who had spoken the words that would haunt Ozzy's final months. He opened musical doorways for people like me at a time when we were very young and looking for inspiration. Black Sabbath and Ozzy were very instrumental in opening the doorway for punk rock. In the quiet hours after that ceremony, as Sharon helped him back to their hotel room, Ozzy had made a decision. There were people in his life who needed to know what they had meant to him before it was too late. Billy Idol was one of them. If this story is already touching your heart, please hit that like button to show your support. These final moments between legends deserve to be remembered. The letter began taking shape over the following months, written in fragments between doctor's appointments and physical therapy sessions. Billy's own tribute had mentioned seeing Black Sabbath 1 month before the first album came out at Worthing Town Hall in 1968, where he was right at the front and his tassels were touching me. That image had stuck with Ozzy, a teenage Billy Idol, wide-eyed and hungry for something new, standing in the front row as 4 working-class kids from Birmingham unleashed something the world had never heard before. By the time July 2025 arrived and the Back to the Beginning concert was announced, Ozzy knew this letter needed to be finished. The farewell show would be his final statement as a performer, but there were private goodbyes that needed to be said as well. In his Beverly Hills mansion, confined mostly to his wheelchair now, Ozzy would spend hours each day working on letters to the people who had shaped his journey. But Billy's letter was special. It carried the weight of mutual respect between 2 rebels who had changed the face of rock music forever. Sharon would often find him in his study, trembling hands gripping the pen as he fought against the cruel progression of Parkinson's that made even basic tasks monumentally difficult. "You don't have to do this today," she would say gently. But Ozzy was determined. These weren't just letters. They were his final gifts to the people who had walked beside him through the madness of rock and roll. The relationship between Ozzy and Billy had always been complex, layered with professional respect and personal admiration. They were both products of Britain's working-class rebellion, both men who had used music as their escape route from lives that seemed predetermined by poverty and circumstance. Billy had emerged from the punk scene with Generation X, while Ozzy had helped birth heavy metal with Black Sabbath, but their paths had crossed repeatedly over the decades. What many people didn't know was how closely they had followed each other's careers. When Billy was conquering MTV with his theatrical videos and radio-friendly anthems, Ozzy was taking notes. When Ozzy was pushing the boundaries of shock rock and heavy metal theatrics, Billy was paying attention. They were both masters of reinvention, both survivors in an industry that chewed up and spit out most of its stars. The 1980s had been their parallel golden age. While Ozzy was establishing himself as the undisputed Prince of Darkness with albums like Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, Billy was crafting his own brand of rebellious rock with Rebel Yell and White Wedding. They inhabited the same MTV universe, the same radio playlists, the same magazine covers. Yet they maintained a respectful distance, understanding that the rock world was big enough for multiple kings. It was through their mutual friend Billy Morrison, guitarist for Billy Idol and one of Ozzy's closest confidants, that their friendship had deepened in recent years. Morrison often served as the bridge between the 2 legends, sharing stories and maintaining connections that might otherwise have faded. "When Ozzy Osbourne tells you something, you should do it," Morrison had once said, speaking about the wisdom he'd gained from his friendship with the Prince of Darkness. On July 5, 2025, as 42,000 fans gathered at Villa Park for what everyone knew would be Ozzy's final performance, the letter sat completed in his dressing room. When Ozzy took the stage that night, rising from below on his black throne, he could see familiar faces in the VIP section, musicians who had come to pay their respects, to witness history, to say goodbye to the man who had shown them all that rock and roll could be darker, heavier, and more powerful than anyone had ever imagined. Billy Idol wasn't there that night. He was performing in Austria with his own band. But through Billy Morrison, who was devastated to miss the historic show, Ozzy knew that Billy's heart was with them in Birmingham. Billy Idol is playing a show in Austria that night, and God bless Sharon and Billy Idol's manager, Morrison had lamented, understanding the significance of what they were all missing. The concert itself was everything it was supposed to be and more. When Ozzy performed his solo set, accompanied by his longtime band including Zakk Wylde on guitar, the crowd was witnessing the end of an era. Songs like Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, and Mama, I'm Coming Home took on new meaning, each one a chapter in the autobiography of a man who had lived more lives than seemed humanly possible. But it was the Black Sabbath reunion that truly brought the house down. The original lineup, Ozzy, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, together on stage for the first time in 20 years, playing the songs that had literally invented heavy metal. War Pigs, Iron Man, NIB, and Paranoid echoed through Villa Park like ancient hymns, sacred music that had spawned 1,000 bands and changed the lives of millions. As Ozzy sat on his throne, looking out at the sea of faces illuminated by phone screens and stage lights, he thought about Billy. He thought about all the rebels who had followed in their footsteps, all the kids who had found their voices through the music they had created. The letter in his dressing room felt heavier than ever, weighted with everything he needed to say before it was too late. 17 days after that magical night in Birmingham, on July 22, 2025, the music world was shattered by the news that Ozzy Osbourne had passed away at age 76, surrounded by his family. The tributes poured in immediately. Billy Idol's response was among the first and most heartfelt. I'm still in a little bit of shock because just over 2 weeks ago, he was on that Back to the Beginning stage in Birmingham. I didn't expect this to happen, really. Billy continued in his tribute. Ozzy embodied the spirit of rock and roll, and he performed right to the end, as we all saw most recently at the Back to the Beginning concert. My condolences to Sharon Jack Kelly and the whole family. My heart goes out to you. The pain in his words was evident to anyone who knew the deep respect the two men had shared. But what Billy didn't know, what the world didn't know, was that Sharon was carrying something very special in her purse as she made the rounds of condolence calls and thank you visits in the days following the funeral. It was an envelope with Billy's name written in Ozzy's increasingly shaky handwriting, a letter that had been sealed and waiting for the right moment. The funeral had been a celebration of Ozzy's life rather than a mourning of his death. Rock royalty from every generation had gathered to pay their respects. Stories were shared, music was played, and for a few hours it felt like Ozzy was still there with them, probably laughing at all the fuss being made over his departure. 3 days after the service, Sharon found herself on Billy's doorstep in Los Angeles. They had known each other for decades, had shared the unique bond of British rock royalty transplanted to the City of Angels. When Billy opened the door, she could see the grief etched on his face, the same grief that was consuming everyone who had known and loved Ozzy. He wanted you to have this, Sharon said simply, pressing the envelope into Billy's hands. Her voice was still raw from days of crying and hosting and trying to be strong for everyone else. He wrote it months ago, finished it just after the Rock Hall ceremony. He was very specific that you should only read it after everything was finished. Billy's hands trembled as he held the envelope. His name was written across the front in that unmistakable scrawl, and underneath, in smaller letters, Ozzy had written, "For Billy, the rebel who showed me that different roads can lead to the same place." Alone in his music room, surrounded by guitars and gold records and memories of his own legendary career, Billy carefully opened the seal. The room was filled with the artifacts of his own rebellion: leather jackets, platinum albums, photographs from decades of tours and television appearances. But none of it mattered now. What mattered was the voice speaking to him from beyond the grave, the final words of a man who had understood the weight of their shared legacy. Inside, written on multiple pages in Ozzy's rambling but heartfelt style, was a letter that would change how Billy understood their friendship forever. My dear Billy, if you're reading this, then the mad bastard from Birmingham has finally taken his last bow. Sharon's probably been crying for days. She always was the emotional one, bless her. And you're probably sitting there wondering why an old fool like me would bother writing you a letter when I could barely hold a pen steady anymore. My hands shake so badly now that half the time I can't even sign autographs without looking like I'm having a seizure. Well, shut up and listen, because this might be the most important thing I've ever told you, and God knows I've told you a lot of bollocks over the years. Do you remember that night at the Rock Hall when you sang No More Tears? I was sitting there in that fucking wheelchair watching you pour your heart into one of my songs, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. You weren't just performing my music, you were channeling something deeper, something that connected us across all these decades of rock and roll madness. You understood what that song was really about. The pain, the struggle, the refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. But here's what I never told you. What I should have told you years ago. You've been an inspiration to me for longer than you probably realize. Yeah, you heard that right. The so-called Prince of Darkness was inspired by Billy fucking Idol. I know that probably sounds like complete madness, but hear me out. I remember the first time I really paid attention to what you were doing. This was back in the early 80s, when we were both trying to prove that we could survive without our original bands. You'd left Generation X, I'd been kicked out of Sabbath, and we were both these middle-aged guys trying to convince the world that we still had something to say. The music industry was telling us we were yesterday's news, that the kids wanted something newer, shinier, more disposable. Then I heard White Wedding and Rebel Yell, and I thought, this bastard gets it. You weren't trying to recapture your youth or repeat what you'd done before. You were evolving, adapting, taking everything you'd learned from punk and new wave and turning it into something that was completely, unmistakably you. You were showing all of us that reinvention wasn't about abandoning who you were. It was about becoming more yourself than ever. And that sneer, Billy, that perfect fuck you attitude that made punk rock so dangerous in the first place. You never lost it, not even when you were selling millions of records and getting heavy rotation on MTV. You proved that you could be subversive and successful at the same time, that you didn't have to choose between artistic integrity and commercial appeal. That was a lesson I needed to learn, and watching you do it showed me the way. You know what I loved most about your career trajectory? You took risks that scared the shit out of other people. Dancing with Myself could have been career suicide, a song about isolation and self-reliance, when everyone wanted anthems about partying and getting laid. But you understood something that a lot of musicians never figure out. The most universal songs come from the most personal places. I learned from that, Billy, more than I ever admitted, more than I probably even realized at the time. When I was working on albums like Bark at the Moon and The Ultimate Sin, I was thinking about what you were doing, how you were taking risks, how you were unafraid to be theatrical and larger than life while still keeping that dangerous edge that made rock music matter. And let's talk about that night at Worthing Town Hall in 1968 that you mentioned. You were just a kid then, standing right up front, and you said my tassels were touching you. What you probably didn't know is that I could see you there. This intense young face staring up at us with such hunger, such desperate need for something real and powerful and transformative. You were everything we were trying to reach. The kids who felt like outsiders, who needed music to be more than just entertainment, who needed it to be salvation. That image has stayed with me all these years. Whenever I'd start to doubt whether what we were doing mattered, whether we were just making noise for the sake of making noise, I'd think about that kid in the front row, about how music could change a life, could give someone permission to be different, to be themselves, to be extraordinary. Over the years, I've watched you inspire your own generations of kids the same way. I've seen them at your concerts, singing along to Dancing with Myself and Eyes Without a Face, with the same desperate passion that you brought to that first Sabbath show. You've given them permission to be rebels, to be different, to be themselves in a world that's constantly trying to make everyone the same. But it's not just your music that's inspired me, Billy. It's the way you've lived your life. You've had your struggles. We all have. But you've never let them define you. I know about the motorcycle accident. I know about the battles with addiction. I know about the times when the industry tried to write you off as a has-been. But you never stopped creating, never stopped pushing boundaries, never stopped being that sneering, beautiful, dangerous rebel who first caught my attention all those years ago. I know we've never been the closest of friends. We're both alpha dogs, both used to being the center of attention, both carrying around egos the size of Birmingham and London combined. But there's been a mutual respect between us that I've treasured, a recognition that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're keepers of the flame, guardians of the idea that rock music can still be dangerous, still be transformative, still matter in a world that's increasingly disposable and superficial. Do you remember that photo shoot we did together back in the 80s? Some magazine wanted to do a piece on British rock invaders or some such nonsense. We spent half the day arguing about whose hair was more ridiculous and whether your leather pants were tighter than mine. But when the cameras started rolling, we clicked. We understood each other's theatrical instincts, each other's need to create larger-than-life personas that could carry the weight of our music and our messages. That's what I want you to remember about me, Billy. Not the sick old man who couldn't walk, or the reality TV star who became a parody of himself. Remember, the guy who understood that rock music is theatre, that being a performer means being willing to sacrifice everything, your privacy, your sanity, sometimes your health, to create moments of transcendence for people who need them more than they need their next breath. You've done that, Billy. You've created those moments. Every time some kid discovers Rebel Yell and realizes that it's okay to be angry, okay to be different, okay to want more from life than what society has planned for them, you've changed a life. Every time someone hears White Wedding and understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is walk away from something that's killing your soul, you've saved someone. That's the real legacy of rock music, isn't it? Not the awards or the sales figures or the Hall of Fame inductions, though those are nice. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there, some kid is listening to your music and finding the courage to be themselves, to fight for their dreams, to refuse to accept a life of quiet desperation. I think about all the musicians who've looked up to both of us over the years, who've told me they feel like they're in the presence of rock history when they meet you. But what they don't realize is that history isn't something that happened in the past. It's something that's still being written every time you step on stage, every time you pick up a guitar, every time you refuse to compromise your vision for the sake of commercial appeal. I know my time is running out, Billy. This fucking disease is winning, and I'm tired of fighting it. Some days I can barely remember my own name, let alone the words to songs I've been singing for 50 years. But I'm not afraid, because I know that what we've created together, all of us who've dedicated our lives to this beautiful, mad, impossible thing called rock and roll, is going to outlive us all. The music will survive, the attitude will survive, the rebellious spirit will find new voices and new ways to express itself. Kids who weren't even born when we were in our prime are discovering our music every day, finding in it the same salvation that we found in the blues and rock and roll that came before us. What I need you to do for me is this: keep being Billy Idol. Don't ever let them tame you. Don't ever let them convince you that you're too old or too irrelevant or too whatever. The world needs rebels now more than ever, needs people who are willing to stand up and say, "This is who I am, take it or leave it." The world needs the sneer, the attitude, the refusal to compromise. Keep making music that matters, music that comes from somewhere real and dangerous and true. Keep inspiring kids to be themselves, to take risks, to refuse to accept the limitations that other people try to place on them. Keep being living proof that you can grow older without growing tame, that experience doesn't have to mean resignation. And when you're on stage, when you're in that zone where nothing exists except the music and the connection with the audience, remember that you're carrying on something that started with 4 kids from Birmingham who decided to make the heaviest, darkest, most powerful music the world had ever heard. Remember that every chord you play, every lyric you sing, every time you make someone feel less alone in the world, you're honoring not just my memory, but the memory of everyone who ever believed that rock music could change the world. I love you, Billy Idol. Not in a sentimental way, we're both too tough for that shit, but with the deep respect and affection that one warrior has for another. You've been a worthy adversary, a trusted ally, and a constant reminder that the rebel spirit can take many forms but never really dies. Thank you for being my friend, even when we barely spoke. Thank you for keeping the flame alive when it would have been easier to fade away. Thank you for showing me that different roads can indeed lead to the same place, and that place is a stage where broken down rebels can still make magic happen. Keep the faith, keep the sneer, and keep the music alive. The world is counting on you. even if they don't know it yet. All my respect and admiration, Ozzy. P.S. I know you probably think this letter is too long and too sentimental, but tough shit. Sometimes even the Prince of Darkness gets emotional. Besides, you've got that beautiful voice. If anyone can handle reading something this sappy out loud, it's you. P.P.S. Sharon wants me to tell you that you're welcome at the house anytime. She's always liked you, probably because you're one of the few people who can out-attitude me. Just don't bring that fucking motorcycle. The neighbors are already suspicious enough, and we don't need them calling the cops again. P.P.P.S. If you ever write a book about our friendship, make sure you include the story about that time we got trapped in that elevator together in New York and spent 2 hours arguing about whether punk was dead or just sleeping. That conversation taught me more about the future of rock music than any record executive ever did. Also, make sure you mention how we both agreed that the music industry was going to hell, but that real rock and roll would survive, because it always has. We were right about that, weren't we? By the time Billy finished reading, tears were streaming down his face, without shame or embarrassment. The letter fell from his hands as decades of memories flooded back. Every encounter, every nod of mutual respect, every moment when two rebels from different corners of the British Isles had recognized something essential in each other. The man the world knew as Billy Idol, the sneering, leather-clad rebel who had conquered MTV and defined an era, broke down completely, because Ozzy had seen him, really seen him, in ways that Billy had never fully appreciated. The Prince of Darkness had understood that beneath the theatrical poses and the carefully crafted image was another working-class kid who had used music to transform himself, to find his voice, to inspire others to find theirs. Billy sat in his music room for hours, reading and rereading Ozzy's words, feeling the weight of a friendship that had been deeper than either of them had ever acknowledged publicly. Here was proof that their parallel journeys through rock and roll had been more connected than coincidence, that they had been watching each other, learning from each other, inspiring each other across decades of tours and albums and reinventions. 2 weeks later, when Billy took the stage at his next concert, he dedicated Rebel Yell to Ozzy's memory. As he sang the opening lines, "Last night a little dancer came dancing to my door," he could feel the old bastard there with him, probably laughing at how sentimental they'd both become, but proud nonetheless that the message was still getting through. "This one's for Ozzy Osbourne," Billy told the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "The Prince of Darkness, who showed all of us that rock and roll could be darker, heavier, and more powerful than anyone ever imagined. He wrote me a letter before he died, and in it, he reminded me that we're all keepers of the flame. So let's keep that flame burning bright." The crowd erupted, and as Billy launched into the song that had defined his career, he understood something that Ozzy had been trying to tell him all along. They weren't just entertainers or celebrities or rock stars. They were guardians of something sacred, something that gave meaning to the lives of people who felt like outsiders, who needed permission to be different, who found their tribe in the dark corners of rock and roll. The rock and roll rebellion lived on, just as it always had, just as it always would. And somewhere in the great beyond, Ozzy Osbourne was probably raising a glass to all the rebels who refused to grow old gracefully, who kept the sneer alive, who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to compromise. The Prince of Darkness was gone, but his final letter to Billy Idol would echo through rock history, a reminder that true rebellion isn't about breaking rules for the sake of breaking them, but about having the courage to be authentically yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you into something else. In the days that followed, Billy would find himself returning to the letter again and again, finding new meaning in Ozzy's words each time he read them. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a call to action, a reminder of responsibility, a passing of the torch from one generation of rebels to the next. And Billy Idol, the Rebel Yell himself, understood that the best way to honor Ozzy's memory wasn't through tears or tributes, but through the simple act of continuing to be himself, unapologetically, authentically, rebelliously himself. Because that's what rock and roll had always been about, the courage to be different in a world that demands conformity, the strength to keep fighting even when the odds are stacked against you, and the faith that somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly what you have to say. If this story moved you, Please hit that like button and share it to keep the memory of these rock legends alive. The bond between Ozzy and Billy reminds us that music isn't just entertainment. It's a lifeline for everyone who's ever felt like an outsider, everyone who's ever needed permission to be different, everyone who's ever found their tribe in the rebellious spirit of rock and roll.